Rising anti-imperialist sentiments in West Africa. Liberian protesters condemn alleged Ivorian and U.S. meddling in Burkina Faso. Welcome to the Bold African Voice, BAV, where Africa speaks truth to power. I'm Abdul Karim Kargbo, born and raised in Africa. In today's video, Liberian protesters take a stand against foreign interference in Burkina Faso. But this is more than a protest. It's a continental call for self-determination. Stay with us as we unpack the real story behind the slogans, the history behind the headlines, and the vision behind the resistance. Africa, the world is watching. In a dramatic development that signals the intensifying resistance to perceived foreign influence in West Africa, a group of Liberian citizens staged a protest outside the Ivorian Embassy in Monrovia on Wednesday, accusing the governments of Côte d'Ivoire and the United States of interference in the domestic politics of Burkina Faso. The protest reflects a deepening regional unease with external political involvement, especially in states undergoing complex transitions like Burkina Faso. The demonstration, though relatively small in scale, carried a powerful message. Protesters waved placards that read, "Hands off Burkina Faso, Africa for Africans," and "Down with Neocolonialism." They chanted slogans opposing what they described as a continuation of imperialist tactics under the guise of diplomacy and development support. Their anger was directed specifically at what they see as an orchestrated effort by the U.S. and Ivory Coast to destabilize Burkina Faso's transitional government under President Ibrahim Traoré. President Traoré came to power in 2022 following a military coup that overthrew the elected government of President Paul-Henri Damiba, who himself had seized power just months earlier in January 2022. Since then, Traoré has positioned himself as a revolutionary leader committed to restoring Burkinabe sovereignty, expelling French troops, and strengthening relations with Russia and other non-Western allies, a position that has drawn both regional admiration and international criticism. Contextualizing the protests, a regional trend. The protests in Liberia are not an isolated incident. They fit within a broader trend of Pan-African solidarity movements opposing perceived neocolonial influence across the continent. Over the past 2 years, coups in Mali, 2020-2021, Guinea 2021, and Niger 2023, have also triggered widespread debates over sovereignty, Western involvement, and regional governance under ECOWAS. In all these countries, military juntas have risen to power with pledges to sever or revise long-standing relationships with former colonial powers like France and institutions such as the United Nations and ECOWAS. Critics of ECOWAS, including some of the very governments under military rule, have increasingly portrayed the body as a tool of Western foreign policy. The alleged silence or selective condemnation of external meddling in these transitional states has further stoked distrust. In Burkina Faso's case, the Traoré-led government has accused foreign actors, including the US and France, of attempting to undermine national unity under the pretense of human rights and democratic reforms, analyzing the allegations of foreign meddling. As a publication, neither the U.S. Embassy nor the Ivorian Embassy in Monrovia has issued a formal statement responding to the protesters' accusations. However, Washington has previously expressed concern over the direction of governance in Burkina Faso, particularly the country's withdrawal from the G5 Sahel counterterrorism initiative and its pivot toward Russian military assistance. Similarly, Ivory Coast has had a complicated relationship with the Burkinabe leadership. Ivorian President Alassane Ouattara has been a vocal supporter of democratic transitions in the region and a key player within ECOWAS. It is not inconceivable, analysts say, that Abidjan could be coordinating with Western allies to apply diplomatic pressure on Ouagadougou, though hard evidence of a regime change agenda remains absent from the public domain. Marquis Nebo, the Liberian youth leader who led the demonstration, encapsulated the growing sentiment among young Africans. The struggles of Burkina Faso are not theirs alone, they are ours. When one African country is targeted, we are all vulnerable, he told journalists at the scene. His comments reflect the rising Afro-nationalist narrative that connects the legacy of colonial exploitation with modern geopolitical maneuvering, police clampdown, and freedom of assembly in Liberia. While the protest remained largely peaceful, the Liberian National Police intervened before the group could deliver their petition to other diplomatic missions in Monrovia. Police cited the lack of an official protest permit as grounds for halting the march. Protest organizers, however, claimed they had submitted multiple requests to the Ministry of Justice without receiving a reply. This clash highlights a troubling pattern across several African states, where citizen-led protests, especially those involving political expression or international critique, are met with bureaucratic stonewalling or security force suppression. Though the protesters vowed to continue their campaign through legal channels, it remains uncertain whether the Ministry of Justice will respond any differently in the coming days. Comparative reflections across Africa. The sovereignty dilemma. What is happening in Liberia mirrors a broader ideological rift playing out across Africa, a fierce debate between sovereignty and international cooperation. In nations like Mali and Niger, military leaders have expelled French troops and accused international organizations of bias and interference. These states have increasingly turned to Russia, Turkey, and China as alternative development and security partners. Even in more stable democracies like South Africa, Kenya, and Senegal, civil society organizations are raising critical questions about the role of Western NGOs, embassies, and corporate interests in shaping domestic agendas. The result is a political environment where Western engagement is being scrutinized more than ever, not just by state actors, but also by ordinary citizens. A 2024 Afrobarometer survey conducted in 12 African countries revealed that 61% of respondents believe that African countries should reduce their dependency on foreign aid and instead seek intra-African cooperation. In Burkina Faso, public trust in President Traoré remains relatively strong, particularly among younger populations disillusioned by years of French involvement with little visible economic or security improvement. The ECOWAS conundrum, integration or fragmentation. This surge in Pan-African nationalism also places ECOWAS in a precarious position. Once a beacon of regional integration and democracy promotion, the West African bloc is now facing credibility challenges. The military regimes in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger have all suspended their participation in ECOWAS, forming instead the Alliance of Sahel States, a military and economic bloc aimed at counterbalancing ECOWAS's influence. If ECOWAS continues to be perceived as a vehicle of foreign interests rather than a neutral arbiter, its relevance may diminish further. Countries like Ghana and Nigeria, once vocal supporters of democratic norms, are now under pressure to recalibrate their approach toward neighbors under transitional rule. Meanwhile, civil society movements, like the one witnessed in Monrovia, may push for a redefinition of what sovereignty and solidarity mean in the 21st century African context. Diplomatic tensions and the future of regional diplomacy. The protests in Monrovia, while centered around Burkina Faso's sovereignty, have inadvertently added to the growing diplomatic strain among ECOWAS member states. As Liberia becomes the latest arena for this contestation, the question arises, what role should regional diplomacy play when citizens themselves begin to challenge the legitimacy of foreign engagements and, by extension, their government's foreign policy alignments? Observers fear that the incident may exacerbate tensions between Liberia and its neighbors. While Liberia's official foreign policy remains aligned with ECOWAS principles, including democracy, rule of law, and regional cooperation, its political leadership must now walk a tightrope. On one side lies its historical alliance with Western and Francophone neighbors. On the other lies growing domestic voices demanding a shift toward more independent Pan-African positions. Ivory Coast, a key ally of the West and a major economic player in the region, may not take kindly to being publicly accused of subversion, given its internal security concerns following the fallout from civil wars in the 2000s and its recent hardline position on coups in the region. Abidjan is likely to demand clarification or even an apology through diplomatic channels. The United States, on the other hand, may view the Monrovia protests as a test of its soft power in Africa. As Washington reasserts its presence across the continent amid a growing Chinese and Russian footprint, incidents like this call into question the effectiveness of American diplomacy, particularly when it comes to shaping narratives around governance and development. The role of youth and civic movements. The leading figure in the Monrovia protest, Marquis Nebo, is emblematic of a broader youth awakening that is reshaping political discourse across Africa. Increasingly, African youth are rejecting what they perceive as stale, Western-aligned elite consensus and are instead embracing messages of self-determination, continental solidarity, and economic nationalism. Youth-led movements in countries like Senegal, Nigeria, and the Democratic Republic of Congo have all demonstrated similar sentiments in recent years, whether in the form of NSARS protests, anti-French demonstrations, or Pan-African solidarity marches. These movements, often decentralized and digitally connected, are redefining the tools of political engagement and influence. Moreover, the cross-border nature of this protest signals an evolution of African civic consciousness, one no longer bound by national borders, but animated by a shared continental experience of exploitation, underdevelopment, and political manipulation. If supported by viable political reforms, these movements could form the foundation for a new Pan-African democratic culture. If suppressed, however, they could spiral into more radical or reactionary movements, potentially destabilizing fragile democracies. Burkina Faso's transitional government, an uncertain path. President Ibrahim Traoré's government continues to polarize both regional and international observers. On one hand, the administration has embarked on a campaign to strengthen national production, education reform, and local security capacity through the Volunteers for the Defense of the Homeland, VDP. On the other, it faces mounting criticism from human rights organizations and Western powers over alleged abuses, media suppression, and lack of a clear electoral timeline. The challenge Traoré faces is not unique. Across Africa, transitional regimes, whether civilian or military, are struggling to strike a balance between asserting sovereignty and satisfying external demands for democratic processes. The Burkina Faso administration, buoyed by a wave of popular support, especially among youth and rural communities, has framed its legitimacy around its rejection of foreign domination and promises of national renaissance. Nonetheless, without a clear and inclusive roadmap for transition to civilian rule, the regime risks alienating internal allies and providing ammunition for external critics. The longer Burkina Faso remains outside of ECOWAS frameworks and international norms, the greater the risk of economic isolation, sanctions, or foreign-backed destabilization efforts, the very scenarios the Monrovia protesters warned against. Media silence and information warfare. Notably, both the Ivorian and U.S. embassies in Monrovia remained silent as of Thursday evening. The lack of official response, while perhaps diplomatically calculated, has allowed speculation and misinformation to flourish in media and online spaces. In an age where perception often trumps reality, the information vacuum surrounding such protests can be weaponized by various actors to advance ideological or geopolitical narratives. Russia, for instance, has gained significant ground in West African public opinion by portraying itself as an anti-imperialist partner. The Wagner Group's now fragmented presence in Mali and Central African Republic has been accompanied by pro-Kremlin media campaigns designed to portray Western actors as exploitative and hypocritical. In contrast, Western embassies and development institutions often fail to meaningfully engage with grassroots sentiments or social media spaces, allowing narratives of imperialism, neocolonialism, and interference to proliferate unchecked. The Monrovia protest underscores the need for a recalibration in public diplomacy strategies. If foreign actors hope to maintain credibility, they must do more than issue formal statements. They must engage local voices, clarify their intentions, and promote transparent partnerships grounded in mutual respect and shared prosperity. Reimagining ECOWAS, between relevance and rejection. As internal civic resistance and nationalist sentiments rise, ECOWAS finds itself in a pivotal moment, one that demands institutional transformation or risks accelerating obsolescence. The once celebrated bloc that championed economic integration and democratic norms now faces internal fractures, widespread mistrust, and accusations of acting as a proxy for Western interests. The departure of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger from ECOWAS to form the Alliance of Sahel States, AES, in early 2024 was a seismic moment in West African geopolitics. The move reflected more than just a political alliance between three military-led governments. It symbolized the rejection of a regional order seen as disproportionately influenced by external actors, particularly France and the United States. These countries cited ECOWAS, sanctions, and military intervention threats as illegitimate tools of coercion that failed to address the root causes of instability. In this context, the protest in Monrovia is not merely a localized incident. It represents a referendum on ECOWAS's image and functionality. The bloc's recent moves, including controversial military standby forces and inconsistent diplomatic messaging, have been perceived as reactionary rather than reformative. To remain relevant, ECOWAS must re-examine its founding principles and operational mandates. Key reform areas include institutional neutrality. ECOWAS must reaffirm its independence from any foreign power bloc and realign itself as a genuinely African-driven institution. This involves reducing donor dependency and establishing funding mechanisms that give African states greater control over the bloc's agenda. Conflict mediation versus political policing. ECOWAS must shift from its increasingly punitive posture to one focused on inclusive dialogue, conflict prevention, and peace building, a role it historically played during civil wars in Liberia and Sierra Leone in the 1990s. Youth and civil society. Inclusion. With Africa's youth bulge and rising civic engagement, ECOWAS must create formal avenues for young people and civil society organizations to participate in shaping regional governance frameworks. Flexible governance models. Instead of enforcing a rigid, uniform model of democracy, the bloc could explore context-specific transitional arrangements that reflect each nation's socio-political reality while keeping them within the ECOWAS fold. Unless ECOWAS reinvents itself, its perceived alliance with former colonial powers and elite interests will continue to erode its legitimacy. Without urgent reforms, more member states may follow the AES path, threatening the dream of West African unity. Balancing sovereignty with accountability, a continental dilemma. As African nations assert their sovereignty more vocally, the continent now faces a delicate dilemma: how to defend national self determination without enabling autocratic entrenchment. The resurgence of anti imperialist sentiment, while historically justified, has in some cases become a double edged sword, invoked not only against foreign exploitation, but also to silence domestic critics. The case of Burkina Faso is emblematic. President Ibrahim Traoré's government has gained legitimacy by positioning itself as a revolutionary alternative to Western backed liberal democracy, yet credible reports from human rights organizations, including Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, have highlighted extrajudicial killings, arbitrary detentions, and shrinking civic space under his watch. In this context, the line between resistance to neocolonialism and internal repression becomes dangerously thin. Similar dynamics have played out in other countries within the Alliance of Sahel states. In Mali, press freedom has declined sharply under Assimi Goïta's military government. In Niger, General Abdourahmane Chiani's junta has banned political parties and detained former ministers. While these actions are often defended as necessary for national security or transition stabilization, they risk creating a precedent where military-led regimes claim perpetual legitimacy under the banner of sovereignty. This emerging political model, a fortress sovereignty approach, shields leadership from both foreign and domestic scrutiny. It appeals to Pan-African pride, yet lacks the institutional guardrails that protect citizens' rights. A call for Afrocentric democratic innovation. To move forward, Africa must carve a new governance path, one that neither mimics Western liberalism uncritically, nor embraces authoritarian nationalism under the guise of anti-imperialism. This requires the development of Afrocentric democratic models tailored to local realities, historical experiences, and socio-cultural frameworks. Examples of this can already be seen in localized conflict resolution mechanisms in Rwanda, community-based participation models in Senegal's rural councils, and consultative assemblies in parts of Somaliland. These systems emphasize consensus, accountability, and cultural legitimacy, qualities often absent in externally imposed governance structures. ECOWAS, the African Union, AU, and sub-regional blocs must support the institutionalization of such indigenous frameworks. Instead of threatening sanctions on states undergoing transitions, these bodies could offer technical support, legal expertise, and regional guarantees to ensure inclusive processes that lead to credible elections and civilian rule. Additionally, civil society must be empowered, not just to protest or resist, but to govern. Youth groups, traditional leaders, religious institutions, women's cooperatives, and diaspora networks should be actively integrated into policymaking and peace-building structures. Only by democratizing power from the grassroots up, not just rotating elite control at the top, can Africa achieve a sovereignty that is both defiant and just. The diaspora's role, bridging struggles and solidarity. Another vital player in this unfolding transformation is the African diaspora. From Monrovia to Minneapolis, from Freetown to London, the African diaspora has historically played an outsized role in shaping liberation struggles, remittance economies, and global advocacy for the continent. The Monrovia protests' Pan-African message resonated far beyond Liberian borders, partly due to diaspora amplification on platforms like Twitter, X, WhatsApp, and YouTube. Diaspora activists, scholars, and influencers have increasingly used their voices to call out Western double standards, support African agency, and push for debt justice, resource sovereignty, and reparations. However, diaspora engagement must go beyond hashtags and statements. It should translate into policy pressure, investment in civic education, and support for democratic institution building on the ground. There are signs of this shift already. Groups like Africans Rising, the AU's Diaspora Division, and the African Diaspora Development Institute are mobilizing resources and ideas to create deeper linkages between home and abroad. If effectively harnessed, the diaspora can serve as a bridge of accountability, advocating for Africa's sovereignty while ensuring that its champions at home remain responsive to the people. Geopolitical implications, a realignment in progress. The growing resistance to US, French, and Ivorian influence, as seen in the Monrovia protest, is not just a West African trend, it is indicative of a continental geopolitical realignment. Africa is repositioning itself in global power dynamics, not as a passive recipient of aid or military assistance, but as an assertive actor seeking mutually beneficial partnerships. This shift can be seen in the rise of BRICS plus influence, with African nations like Egypt and Ethiopia joining the bloc, and others like Algeria expressing interest. Increased South-South cooperation, especially with Latin America and Southeast Asia. Strategic non-alignment in global conflicts, from Ukraine to Gaza, where many African countries have refused to toe Western lines. The continent's ability to leverage its strategic importance as home to critical minerals, the youngest population, and vast untapped markets will determine how successful this realignment becomes. Yet, this leverage must be anchored in internal unity, economic reform, and governance credibility. Otherwise, new alliances may reproduce old patterns of dependency. Grassroots resistance and reform, the pulse of a rising continent. To fully grasp the momentum behind the Monrovia protest and its Pan-African resonance, one must examine the growing patchwork of grassroots movements across Africa that are reclaiming political space, contesting foreign influence, and proposing people-centered alternatives to state failure and elite capture. These decentralized efforts, often led by youth, women, religious groups, farmers, and informal workers, represent the continent's most dynamic frontiers of democratic innovation. 1. Y'en a marre, Senegal's youth uprising against constitutional manipulation. One of the most iconic examples is Senegal's Y'en a marre, We're Fed Up movement, which emerged in 2011 in response to President Abdoulaye Wade's attempt to secure a third term. Started by journalists and rappers, the movement mobilized thousands of young people through civic education, grassroots organizing, and artistic expression. It succeeded in helping prevent constitutional abuse and has since evolved into a permanent civic watchdog. Y'en a marre has inspired similar movements in Burkina Faso, Balai Citoyen, the Democratic Republic of Congo, La Lucha, and Guinea, Tournons la Page, each taking up local governance issues while connecting to the broader continental struggle for dignity and accountability. 2. Balai Citoyen, Burkina Faso's revolutionary backbone. In Burkina Faso, Le Balai Citoyen, the citizens' broom, was instrumental in the 2014 popular uprising that ousted President Blaise Compaoré after 27 years in power. Rooted in youth-led street organizing, music, and civic action, the movement represented a rare fusion of anti-corruption demands and historical memory. Invoking the legacy of Thomas Sankara to demand structural change. Today, even amid political uncertainty under President Traoré, remnants of Balai Citoyen continue to monitor government actions and call for both foreign, non-interference and internal reform. Their existence underscores a nuanced truth. Opposing neocolonialism does not mean giving military rulers a blank check. 3. Abalali Basim Jondolo, South Africa's shack dwellers movement. Far from West Africa, in South Africa's informal settlements, Abalali Basim Jondolo, the shack dwellers movement, has become one of the continent's most radical grassroots organizations. With over 100,000 members, the movement fights for land rights, housing, and dignity for the urban poor. Their resistance to evictions, land grabs, and state neglect is a daily act of sovereignty for people left out of post-apartheid wealth. Despite frequent harassment, assassinations of leaders, and smear campaigns, Abalali remains one of the clearest expressions of bottom-up resistance, asserting that true independence begins where people live and organize. 4. Women's cooperatives and land movements, Kenya and Ghana. In rural Kenya and Ghana, women's cooperatives are quietly but powerfully challenging structural inequalities. These groups have secured land titles for women, created alternative markets outside exploitative trade chains, and pressured local governments for clean water and health care. Unlike headline-making protests, these movements resist through persistence, building alternative economies, strengthening social safety nets, and ensuring political education in local languages. They offer a critical lesson. Resistance is not always reactive. It can also be proactive, generational, and community-led. Lessons for Liberia and West Africa. The Monrovia protest, though modest in scale, taps into a continental ecosystem of civic awakening. What sets it apart is its focus on transnational solidarity, demanding justice for another country's sovereignty, a rare act of African interconnectedness that contrasts with the hypernationalism often seen in political rhetoric. Liberia, itself a nation born out of a Pan-African vision and one that endured civil wars and reconstruction, has a moral responsibility to cultivate this civic spirit rather than suppress it. If supported, such movements could lay the groundwork for regional civil society coalitions that can hold ECOWAS, the African Union, and their member states accountable to the people they claim to serve. But if Liberia, and countries like it, continue to respond with bureaucratic repression, denial of permits, or tacit alignment with foreign powers, they risk igniting a larger backlash. Today's placard could become tomorrow's manifesto. Today's disrupted protest could fuel tomorrow's resistance wave. The challenge before Africa's political class is clear. Listen now, or be forced to reckon later. National security versus civic freedom, the growing tension in African governance. Across the African continent, a rising paradox defines the political moment. As states expand their security apparatuses in the name of stability and sovereignty, civic freedoms are increasingly under siege. This tension between national security and civil liberties has become one of the defining challenges for Africa's political and democratic development, and one that is playing out with renewed urgency in the wake of the Monrovia protest. The Liberian government's decision to block the protesters' attempt to present their petition, citing permit issues and public order laws, echoes a broader trend wherein security and administrative frameworks are used to restrict rather than facilitate peaceful civic expression. In many African countries, laws governing public assembly, cyberspace, NGO registration, and media licensing are being deployed as tools of preemptive censorship. This tightening of civic space often draws justification from fears of terrorism, foreign subversion, or threats to national unity. While legitimate national security concerns do exist, particularly in conflict-prone regions like the Sahel, Lake Chad Basin, and the Horn of Africa, the danger lies in conflating dissent with destabilization. A continental pattern of repression. Nigeria's End SARS movement, which began as a protest against police brutality, was met with military deployment, disinformation campaigns, and frozen bank accounts. The 2020 Lekki Tollgate massacre became a grim symbol of what can happen when governments mistake civic uprising for insurgency. Ethiopia, once hailed as a democratic reformer under Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, has increasingly cracked down on opposition voices and journalists during the Tigray conflict and beyond, blurring the line between anti-terror operations and political suppression. Uganda, under President Yoweri Museveni, has institutionalized the use of security laws to arrest opposition figures, ban political rallies, and control digital spaces, all under the pretext of preventing chaos. Cameroon and Rwanda have adopted similar models, where tight surveillance, strategic disappearances, and pro government media echo chambers create environments in which speaking out comes at immense personal risk. This wave of securitized governance raises urgent questions. How can African states ensure genuine stability if that stability is built on silencing the very voices that ensure long term legitimacy? Can sovereignty be protected without suffocating participation? The risk of security state capture. A more troubling trend is the privatization and politicization of security apparatuses. In many fragile states, political elites have created parallel structures of power within the police, military, or intelligence services, using them not only for national defense, but for internal control, intimidation, and electoral manipulation. This security state capture undermines both democratic transition and developmental goals. It shifts public spending from health, education, and infrastructure to surveillance and coercion. It breeds fear rather than trust, and it often operates with impunity, protected by weak institutions and judicial systems that are either co opted or constrained. In Liberia, for example, the slow bureaucratic response to the protesters' permit requests and the rapid police deployment to halt their actions are reflective of a state still grappling with the legacy of securitization from its civil war years. Despite post conflict reforms and international support, the instinct to contain rather than engage dissent remains embedded in the state's political culture. Redefining security, a people centered framework. To break this cycle, African governments must adopt a people centered definition of security, one that goes beyond border protection and counterinsurgency to include economic dignity, social justice, and political inclusion. This means revising national security policies to align with human rights norms and constitutional protections for freedom of expression and assembly. Establishing independent oversight bodies for the police and military that include civil society representation, especially from youth and marginalized groups. Training security forces not just in tactical engagement, but in de escalation, crowd management, and rights based approaches to law enforcement. Investing in social cohesion programs that address the root causes of unrest, from unemployment and corruption to exclusion and state violence. Security should be about ensuring the safety of all citizens, not just shielding regimes from critique. The way forward, civic engagement as a strategic asset. Rather than viewing civic movements as threats, African states must come to see organized citizen action as a strategic asset. Protests, petitions, forums, social campaigns, and watchdog journalism provide real-time feedback loops that help governments govern better. They identify gaps, challenge corruption, propose solutions, and energize national development. In a world where legitimacy is increasingly earned, not imposed, the governments that thrive will be those that partner with their people, not rule over them. The Monrovia protest may have been small, but it represents a seismic shift in how Africans perceive their role in shaping the future. As more citizens across the continent refuse to accept top down governance and call for transparency in both domestic and foreign policy, the balance of power is subtly but steadily tilting. The question is no longer whether Africa is rising, it is how it will rise and who will be included in that journey. Aligning with Agenda 2063, youth movements as the vanguard of Africa's future. The African Union's Agenda 2063, the continent's blueprint for inclusive development and self-reliance, envisions an integrated, prosperous, and peaceful Africa driven by its own citizens. But the growing civic unrest, including the recent Monrovia protest, suggests a glaring disconnect between this ambitious vision and the lived realities of many Africans. Youth-led civic movements are both a reality check and a strategic opportunity for Agenda 2063. Their demands, from justice and good governance to sovereignty and equitable development, directly align with the agenda's core pillars, including political inclusion, accountable institutions, and African-driven partnerships. Yet, many governments view these movements as nuisances rather than partners. If African leaders continue to suppress these civic expressions, they will not only betray the vision of Agenda 2063, but also risk alienating the very demographic that holds the key to achieving it, Africa's youth, who now constitute over 60% of the continent's population. For Agenda 2063 to move from paper to practice, civic engagement must be institutionalized, not criminalized. Youth groups must be integrated into policy design, budget monitoring, and regional dialogues. Governments must invest in education systems that prioritize critical thinking and civic knowledge, not just exam results. And continental institutions must protect these spaces through clear protocols, funding support, and legal frameworks. The role of regional and continental courts. In the face of shrinking civic space and increasing state impunity, regional and continental courts remain among the last lines of defense for democratic rights in Africa. Institutions like the African Court on Human and People's Rights, AFCHPR, the ECOWAS Community Court of Justice, and the East African Court of Justice, EACJ, have issued bold rulings affirming freedom of speech, assembly, and political participation. These bodies have, in many instances, offered recourse for activists and opposition leaders who face repression in domestic courts. However, these courts face significant challenges: underfunding, non-compliance by member states, and political pressure. Notably, several countries, including Côte d'Ivoire and Benin, have withdrawn their citizens' rights to access the African Court directly, signaling a troubling retreat from regional accountability mechanisms. To preserve civic space and constitutionalism, African leaders must reaffirm their commitment to these courts by respecting and implementing court rulings, ensuring individual access to justice across borders, providing legal protections for human rights defenders, promoting judicial independence both nationally and regionally. The health of Africa's democracies will increasingly depend on the strength of its regional justice systems. Advice to African leaders. As civic resistance and anti-imperialist sentiment rise, African leaders must embrace a moment of deep reflection and strategic transformation. The protests in Monrovia are a message, not just to Ivory Coast or the United States, but to every African president, minister, and policymaker. 1. Listen before the streets erupt. Peaceful protests are early warnings, not inconveniences. Suppressing them only builds pressure for more explosive outcomes. 2. Reclaim sovereignty without rejecting accountability. True sovereignty does not come from isolation or repression. It comes from earning the trust and mandate of your people through just, inclusive, and transparent governance. 3. Invest in youth as co-builders, not threats. Today's youth are not tomorrow's leaders. They are today's stakeholders. Empower them through access to decision-making, entrepreneurship, and civic space. 4. Decolonize your foreign policy. Break free from dependency on former colonial powers, but also avoid new forms of neo-dependency, whether from the East or West. Build multilateral, African-centered alliances rooted in mutual respect and dignity. 5. Protect civic space, media, and civil society. A vibrant democracy is not a luxury, it is a development tool. The more informed and engaged your citizens are, the stronger your nation becomes. Key messages and takeaways. The Monrovia protest reflects a growing Pan-African resistance to foreign meddling, especially in contexts like Burkina Faso, where citizens feel their sovereignty is under siege. This civic uprising is part of a larger continental wave of youth-led movements demanding justice, accountability, and self-determination. The tension between national security and civil freedom is becoming a defining political battleground in Africa, requiring urgent legal, political, and civic reforms. Africa must reimagine its institutions, from ECOWAS to the AU, to better reflect grassroots voices and uphold the principles of Agenda 2063. Civic space is not a threat. It is the foundation of sovereign, sustainable, and peaceful development. African leaders must choose a path forward: repression or renewal, dependency or dignity, fragmentation or unity. The African future will not be written by foreign embassies or elite deals behind closed doors. It will be shaped by the collective courage of its people, one protest, one policy, and one principle at a time. Thank you for watching The Bold African Voice, BAV, where we analyze the issues shaping our continent with clarity, courage, and commitment. If you believe in an Africa governed by its people and not puppeteers, then hit that like, subscribe, and share button. Drop your thoughts in the comments. We want to hear your voice. And remember, Africa's future belongs to those bold enough to fight for it. See you in the next broadcast.